I'm very sorry I can't be with you today, and that's simply because I can't be in two places at once. But I'm making this recording in the friend's garden near to where I live. And we're making it in the garden because if I can't be there myself with you, I hope that it may bring you some of the atmosphere of the English countryside where I am. From time to time you'll hear the occasional country noise, and you'll probably hear an aeroplane now and again. And you may see a butterfly flying across my face, because I've seen several of these while I've just been sitting here waiting. Now, I've noticed the title of your conference with enormous interest: Museums, Yes or No. That seems to suggest to me that there are people whom you know who don't think museums should exist anymore. That you're arguing with them, so to speak, that they should exist, they do something useful. And I wanted to talk about this from a particular point of view, an angle that interests me very much. I want to talk about what I'm calling the public aspects of museums. Now, I've been spending a lot of time looking at museums from this direction in the last 20 years, because the European Museum of the Year Award, of which I've been director for actually now 21 years, stands in a very interesting strategic position. It's halfway along a line that has, on the one end, the people who earn their living from museums, if you like, the museum professionals, and at the other end of the line there are the people who visit museums, the public. And the European Museum of the Year Award, and I myself, are put in the middle of that line so that we face both ways. We face towards the museum professionals in that direction, and we face towards the public in that direction. So that I have, so to speak, two masters. Now, it's very obvious to me that if you work in a museum, it's possible to have two completely different attitudes towards the public, towards your visitors, if you like. There are those people who work in museums who regard the public as a nuisance. They wish they weren't there, they wish they didn't have to do things for them. These are people who see museums essentially as treasure houses of beautiful and valuable things. On the other hand, there are people who are fundamentally communicators. They're people who want to explain and interpret what they have in the museum, and these two kinds of people will have different attitudes towards the same museum. Now, my own personal attitude I ought to make fairly clear, I think, at the beginning, and it's this: that in a museum, I like to look at an object and to let my imagination work on it. That's to say, I like to say to myself, what am I learning from this object which kicks my imagination into life, which helps me to have a better understanding of the world in which we live, the country in which I live, a better understanding of history. I see museums as places with that function. Now, that means that I'm not prepared to accept as being a museum an institution which doesn't have original objects of some kind. I'm not saying how many, I'm not saying what kind of objects, it doesn't matter. The objects can be stuffed monkeys, the objects can be chairs, the objects can be paintings. It doesn't matter, but there has to be some kind of physical objects for the place to be called a museum, to be entitled to be called a museum. Now, I know perfectly well that museums are, as we say in the commercial world, labor-intensive places. That's to say, you have to have a certain number of staff, personnel, in order to present the objects to the public in a way that makes sense, in a way that's attractive. You have to have a certain number of people who will look after them. You have to have people of a different variety of people That's to say, you've got to have, on the one hand, people who are essentially at the back of the stage, whom the public doesn't see, and these are the people who are looking after the objects. And on the other, you have to have in the front of the stage the people who are essentially showmen, people who are there because they like interpreting what they've got to the public. Now, let me give an example of what I mean. We had a king, King Charles I, in the middle of the 17th century in England, who was executed. He had his head cut off. And I have seen the actual shirt which Charles I was wearing on the occasion when he put his head down on a wooden block and had his head cut off with a large axe. Now, when I see this shirt in the museum where it's kept, it has to be the original shirt. It's of no importance to me if it's a copy of the shirt. However beautiful it is as a replica, however perfect, if it isn't the actual shirt that he wore, there's no point in putting this into the museum at all. So the original object in this case is essential. On the other hand, supposing it is a Bronze Age pot. Now, a copy, an exact replica of this Bronze Age pot, probably does as much for me personally to stir my imagination as an original pot. It has no difference in its effect on me. So that when I talk about objects in a museum, I'm making a difference between two kinds of objects. One is originals, in some cases you must have them, and in the other case replicas will do equally well. For example, supposing you take the first steam locomotive to run on rails in England. Now, it's very important to be able to preserve that locomotive if you can, and we have in fact preserved it. It's there to be seen, and it has a certain romantic quality. You say how wonderful it is that we've been able to keep it. This is part of the history of my people that I belong to. But I can quite well see that a replica, a copy of that locomotive, if we didn't have it, would have some value. It would show me how it was made, it would show me the size of it, it would explain to me how it worked in a way that a mere picture wouldn't do, or a mere description wouldn't do. Now, when I'm talking about the public quality of museums, which to me is a new phrase, because I know it's new because I invented it myself 2 years ago, I felt the need of some phrase that would explain the position of museums with regard to the public. I said that I can see perfectly well that there are two kinds of qualities which a museum has. On the one hand, there are what you might call the professional virtues. It's easy to see what those are. You buy or you acquire objects in the museum, you conserve them, you look after them, and you present them. Those are the professional virtues. The public virtues are rather different. I've been into many museums, to give you an idea how many. Within the last 21 years, I've visited well over 1,000 museums in different countries of the world. And I've talked to people who work in them. And it's quite clear to me that some of those people are only really interested in the professional virtues. That's to say, I meet people who are interested in collecting, I meet people who are interested in conserving, I meet people who are interested in presenting up to a certain point. But for these people, the public is not of the first importance. Now, that isn't the way my mind works. First of all, I think of a museum essentially as a place that has to have money in order to survive. And where is that money going to come from? The money will come eventually from the taxes of the people who come to see it, taxes they pay to their government or to their local authority, or they will come directly from what they pay to come into the museum, but the public will eventually pay. Now, 4 years ago, I was in Paris, and I was acting as the president of a large meeting at the new Museum of Natural History in Paris, the new National Museum of Natural History. And it was a meeting with about 300 people. Most of them there were people who worked at the museum. They were scientists. They were mostly biologists. And my function as president of this meeting was to provoke discussion among the people there, among these 300 people there, which was not a difficult thing to do. And one man got up, a youngish man about 30, I would say, told me that he was a biologist, that he worked at the museum, and he said, "We are not paid enough money. Our salaries are too low." So I said to him, "Do you know where the money to pay your salary comes from?" And he made that gesture like that French people do, and which always annoys me. When they do that, it means, why do I have to talk to a person of such small intelligence, to such an idiot? And it always makes me rather angry. So I pushed him, and I said, "Well, tell me, where do you think the money to pay your salary comes from?" And he just does this again. He says, "Well, it comes from the Ministry of Education." So I said, "Yes, but where does the Ministry of Education get the money from?" And he once again, this gesture, like that, you see. I said, "I'll tell you where it comes from. It comes from the taxes paid by poor widows." Now, at that point, you get pandemonium breaking out in the audience. Woo, 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 terrible noise. And I said, "Well, where do you imagine it comes from? It must come from there." And there comes a point where you realize that there are some people working in museums that assume the money to run the museum, the money to pay their salaries, comes from the skies, comes from God. And they don't relate it directly to the taxation at all. Now, if we assume, and surely it's reasonable to assume, that the money to run museums must come from the public, then the public must get value for what they pay. I was once asked to define what a good museum was. And I remember saying, and I've written it down, and it's been quoted at me many times since, quite often by people who don't like the definition. I say a good museum is one from which you go out feeling better than you came in. Now, that is a reasonable definition, but it's really a rather clever definition, and it isn't good enough, because it depends who you are. You see, of 100 people going into a museum to visit it, they are 100 different people. They have different personal backgrounds, different education, different families. All these 100 people bring different things to the museum. Now, because they all bring different things to it, they will all get a different amount of value and different kind of value, or no value at all, from what they see. So that you have to be very careful in saying from which one goes out feeling better than one goes in, because the question is, which one are we talking about? Now, there was a very good study made by Professor Michel van Praat, who is now the professor of museology at the Natural History Museum in Paris. And before he was responsible for recreating this big museum, which reopened 4 years ago. And before he did that, he had research carried out in a number of museums of different sizes in different countries, in order to look at what he called the quality of a museum visit. Now, he defined quality as the amount of time which a visitor spends looking at a particular object. And he found that the more people were in the museum at a given time, the less time any one person spent looking at an object. So that the more people in the museum, the lower the quality of the visit. Now, this was not a very popular thing to say, because there are some people who run museums who believe that you measure the success of a museum by the number of visitors that it has, so that the more visitors, the more successful it is. I can't accept that definition, and I'll tell you why I can't accept it. If you were to come to London, perhaps some of you have done actually this, during the summer months, during the 3 months of the summer, the public is allowed to visit the Royal Palace, Buckingham Palace, in the centre of London. If you go in there, this is what you see. You see hundreds of people. It's been extremely successful, and you have to pay quite a lot of money to go in, and you buy a guide. You then go through in a procession which never stops. You go in 4 side by side, and then behind you is another 4 people side by side, as it were, pushing up behind you. There are ropes cutting you off from the room